Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johnny Perez. Thank you for joining us. I work as the Director of U.S. Prison Programs for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, where we work with people who have been impacted by the system and faith leaders in order to push legislative change. We do that in a number of ways. We do that through public education and generating the general public and informing and educating the general public on issues impacting people who are currently being held inside of our nation's prisons, jails, and even detention centers. We also build the capacity of faith leaders and solitary survivors that we work with around the country. And then lastly, we also work with in coalition with change makers and local advocates who are on the front lines of the work and to protect people who are currently incarcerated. And this entire month, we've been trying to have conversations. Actually, not trying. We have been having conversations on faith, race, and justice. And this week, I'm super happy and honored to have with me Danny Murillo, a co-founder of Underground Scholars out of Berkeley, California. And before I kind of let Danny introduce himself, I thought about what we can do in this moment and what conversations need to be had in this moment, who we should be talking to, and kind of guiding and giving guidance and leadership, in the face of all of the different changes that we're currently seeing in society. So today, what I hope to do with Dan is to have a conversation not only on violence and what does that look like and the culture of violence, how does that prevent us from having any type of meaningful change, get into Danny's work specifically around, access to higher education, what does it mean to be an underground scholar, and then lastly, we want to touch on, the hunger strikes in California, which had an impact on solitary confinement, but also what is exactly going on right now and how our, corrections departments are reacting to COVID-19, et cetera. So really just wanted to have an engaging, general, sort of guided conversation around these issues. So Danny, thank you so much again, man, for making time, to have like this one-on-one conversation.
No, for sure, man. Thank you for inviting me, and I really appreciate sharing space with you. We all always have some very fruitful conversations, and now to be able to bring the audience into it, it's even better, right?
Yeah. So no, I tell you, when folks say, oh, you and Danny are talking, what are y'all going to talk about? And I really want to create space for the conversation to go anywhere that it kind of naturally flows. But I want to start at the current political moment, right? Like today is June 19th. And it comes at a time where, the country is literally at political upheaval, unrest. For about almost 30 days now, there's been an outpouring of people of all colors actually coming out in the name of defending Black lives and not and against state-sponsored violence and police violence, et cetera. But we you and I share this experience of incarceration, where we know that, hey, of course, yes, that's part of the problem in policing. Of course, it funnels folks, but really thinking about these issues beyond just, the small changes that we need, and more of a macro kind of a view about what needs to happen, within our nation's prisons, but more importantly, what needs to happen in this country as a whole. So I guess the first question I want to ask you, is to, what does Juneteenth mean, right? Through the lens of freedom for Black and brown people specifically in this country, yeah, what does it mean? But not only what does it mean, but what does it mean today? What does it mean right now at a time where we've seen all of these changes in society, right? We're starting to see some changes that some may argue are superficial changes. Aunt Jemima recently said, hey, we're racist. We shouldn't put we should change our mascot, or Uncle Ben's rice, right? We have the NFL publicly coming out and saying, hey, Black Lives Matter. I turn on Amazon and it says Black Lives Matter. What's your reaction to all of these changes? And then also, the significance of many of these changes coming around this time of Juneteenth and the emancipation and freedom of slavery.
Right. I think change is good, right? But also being conscious and critical of what that change represents, right? For me, a corporation saying, oh, we're going to change our slogan or our logo and not be so blatantly racist with our image. But what about, are you going to change the leadership? Are you going to bring in people that represent a diverse population that exists in the United States? Are you going to make commitments that's going to alleviate a lot of the pressure that some of the workers that work for your company are under, right? Especially in particular with, we could talk about Amazon and the way they treat their workers, in particular during this pandemic. And so, those things are still remnants of a past that exploited people, right? And a system that exploited people for the benefit of a few, right? And so, as we celebrate Juneteenth, right, and the emancipation of those that were enslaved, right, under the system of chattel slavery, recognizing that exploitation of people is something that continues to happen, right? But it just happens much more. It's still there's still ways that it's done where people don't actually know what's going on, right? And we can talk about global capitalism on a larger scale, and I think that probably the conversation might end up going there, right? But I think Juneteenth, it is an important holiday, right? In particular for Black people, right? To recognize that they are an important part of this, the foundation of this country, Like, this country wouldn't be what it is, right? If it wasn't for the history that was the ugly history, right? That this country, the ugly history of this country, right? And it was built on the exploitation of Black people, of enslaved people. It was built on the genocide of indigenous people, and it's something that continues to reverberate even now, And so my concern though with celebrating Juneteenth now, it seems like it's becoming like overnight. It became a mainstream holiday now, right? And my concern is like that we're going to be doing this just these passive tokens of change, right? We're like, now you can get your African pride kente slash at Target and celebrate Juneteenth, right? But what does that mean? Like, are we actually creating real change for people? And and I think that in order for that to happen, there's still a lot of work to be done, and it's much more than just changing logos, right? It's changing systems.
Yeah. So that does bring me to the next question, right? Around this resistance and how, like, some may argue that this country has actually been resistant to change, and in fact, a lot of things that we may be seeing today are the direct reflection of that resistance. The majority of Congress is white. The majority of educators are white. The majority of prosecutors are white. The majority of judges are white. These are all folks that serve as gatekeepers of sorts and can actually impact people's lives and make decisions that have long-term consequences and reparations on people's lives. I think about the judge, I forget his name, out of Pennsylvania, who, the whole Cash for Kids scandal where we're incarcerating kids, and then getting a kickback for every kid that we incarcerate, and how, when you think about, you bring up exploitation, it comes up in so many different ways. How do you react to that? Like, what's your reaction to, like, this country was built and founded on the backs of, enslaved peoples, right? And then we know this history and we've known it for years, right? So much so that we were even complacent for a little while, to the point where folks are actually surprised that there's so much anger, but it shouldn't be a surprise because nothing much has changed since my grandparents were out here, fighting for the same thing that I'm out here fighting for now. So when it comes to resistance, where do you think that resistance is coming from? Which sounds like an elementary question, but more importantly, how do we overcome that resistance? Because it doesn't take Uncle Ben. Like, Uncle Ben knew it was racist 100 years ago when it first did it. And why does it take now the political unrest for somebody in some boardroom to say, wow, we should really think about this, when it's been part of the way that your whole organization was created? So just getting your general reactions on that.
Well, I think a lot of times, with these companies, it's all about the bottom line, right? It's all about the bottom line of their shareholders and their salaries, right? And so I think people are now seeing these folks that are running these companies are seeing that, not just those who are marginalized and exist at the periphery of society, but just even white folks, right, who are allies or accomplices or whatever, like, people are actually pushing back too, right? And so recognizing that there is a collective struggle, pushing back against, in support of Black Lives Matter or in support of defunding the police. I think people that are in these positions that have to reevaluate what's going to benefit them. You know what I mean? And I think, I would like to believe that they're doing it out of the kindness of their heart, but 100 years later, come on.
Yeah. It's sort of like, I heard a friend of mine was like, it feels like, and I know, I do things specifically to Black people, but in this conversation, I want to talk about, I want to use the term like like people of color in general, how we've been, disproportionately marginalized, disproportionately, disproportion down the line, even down to the COVID-19, how we're more likely to die as a result, right? And, but thinking about this idea of, one, what does true change look like, beyond just the superficialities, right? And then, this idea of where, like, in this country, we actually, we put our money a lot of times where our values lie and where our values stand. So when we think about funding, and I know that there's conversations about reparations and things of that nature, but it's more than just, hey, change the name on something or give me a holiday. Can you actually, create the type of, equality where folks will actually have, I don't know whether it's redistribution of income or, have access to, the same type of financial resources that folks need. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like, don't just change something, right? Put your money where your mouth is, specifically for companies that have the money, right? Yeah. Like Amazon, we love you and things like that. I know that they donate some money, but it's like, hey, do more than just change your logo and actually fund this work or support alternatives to what we've been. In other words, listen to the community.
Yeah,
I see you reacting.
And something that you said was that we fund what we value, right? And so what does that say about the way we fund the police, the way we fund the military, and the way we defund public health, the way we defund public education, the way we defund social services that are needed in communities that have been marginalized for centuries, right?
They have proven to work.
Right, yeah. Right, and because there's a lot of people that are doing that great work, right? I was just talking to some brothers here where I'm at about the work that I do. My budget compared to LEPD, it's nothing, right? Nothing, right? But yet, I'm having an impact on not just me, but the people that I work with. We're having an impact on people's lives that are transitioning from incarceration into higher education, right?
Yeah. With
a very limited budget, not over fucking $3 million or $1 billion, right? So you think about, like, if you were to actually fund folks that are actually doing that transformative work, right? What is the changes that can be gained? And I think that is something that needs to be, looked at and interrogated and definitely supported, right? But yeah, going back to the way we fund, what we care for, obviously, the way we fund police and the military shows that we are a country that values violence, right? Because that's exactly what these systems are, right? And they're rooted in that, right? The system of policing is rooted in the history of chattel slavery and also the of capital, right? In the North, policing and its origins took on is very different from the way it originated in the South, but they are both rooted in the idea of protecting property and protecting the resources that are owned by those who have the means and the means of production as owners, right? So definitely the first step is defunding police, defunding these systems that have created a lot of disparities in our community and funding folks that are doing that work, right? But then being mindful of who gets funded, right? I mean, we have to always be mindful that, once the funding starts kicking in, you're going to see a bunch of folks that ain't, that weren't around doing this work, but all of a sudden, now that the funding's there, and who get, who's allocating the funding and who's getting the funding is important to be mindful of, right? Because a lot of times, the people that are doing the work knee deep in the community are not being recognized.
Yeah, nice. I really appreciate that. You know, I often think about, you know, how to best empower and really uplift, you know, the people who are most harmed by these issues, because, you know, I think we can all agree that, you know, our best poised to know exactly what some of these solutions will look like. But two, people should also have agency around what solutions best apply to them. So a lot of times in our communities, we're told what we need to change, right? And because we're told what we need, we get things that we don't want and that we don't need. We get mobile police towers. We get 24-hour porn shops, as if poor people have gold laying around the porn at 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, we get all of these, you know, these check cashing places that charge you to give you your own money, and like these poverty pimps, if you will, you know? And I think that part of, you know, part of what I'm hearing you say that I would like to add is that, like, yes, we need to defund, you know, the police systems and reimagine all of it, right? But at the same time, take these same resources and reallocate them to the resources that we know work. You know, we know mental health services, where we know that people who are employed are less likely to go back to prison. In fact, we know folks who have, you know, access to education are least likely to land, you know, not only in prison, but also least likely to come back if they get their education or discover education while they're inside. Like, we know these things work, but there's a part of, you know, when you talk about their resistance, there is that deliberate, no, we're gonna give, you know, police department, I don't know, X amount of billions of dollars, and then our educators, you know, I've met teachers who are underpaid, understaffed, and overworked. You know, and
they're coming out of their own pocket.
And some coming out of their own pocket. I've met teachers who have to buy their own pencils and things like that. You know, there's a question here in the Zoom comments, and I'm also looking at the Facebook in case people have questions on the Facebook. But Tamara White says, how do we, as a society, best inform the community on responsible companies, right? Remind them to vote and assist with whom to vote for. And I'm sorry, I'll reread it. How do we, as a society, best inform the community on responsible companies, remind them to vote and assist with whom to vote for? Protesting goes a long way, yet does not always remove the wrongful individuals from CEO positions or politicians from office. So I guess, you know, how do we turn the momentum, right? How do we teach communities, and how do we best poise communities, you know, to really hold these companies accountable by voting and actually getting these folks out in the system, assisting folks who to vote for, and understanding that protesting doesn't always get us the changes that we want. So I guess, how do we turn this moment of protesting to actual tangible changes?
Well, I think protesting plays a role, and we might argue that it's not the only role, but there's a lot of different roles that we can play, right, in this movement, right? And one, for me, you know, that I always, that's something that I value, is political education, right? Any kind of movement work that you engage in, if, you know, or if you're going into a community trying to organize folks, always start off with some political education as to why you're trying to address that issue. So if it's policing, then you have to give folks an understanding and a history of origins of policing, right? And so on and so forth, right? If it's trying to abolish prisons or solitary confinement, recognizing that there's a history and origins of how incarceration begins in the United States, right? So always including some type of political education to educate folks, and also remind them that they do have power, right? And that power only comes when it's collective, yo. Like, you can't, you know, when people tell me like, oh, yeah, I'm gonna be the one to end mass incarceration, like, nah, bro, you're not gonna end mass incarceration by yourself. If you can't imagine yourself doing that as a collective work, and even now, I don't imagine my work or the work that I'm doing right now ever ending oppression, because I know that those that oppress us are not taking a day off. Just the same way we don't take a day off to fight for our freedom, people that are oppressing us do not take a day off to keep us oppressed, right? And so for me, you know, I think about this work as generational, right? And so I'm just building on the work that other people have already built before me, right? And I'm just carrying that legacy, right? So it's not just on me. Well, it's on me to continue that legacy, but knowing that I have to always educate people, right? So for me, you know, going back to education is fundamental, right? And again, also recognizing that there's community organizers, there's policy advocates, right? There's legal scholars, there's academics, like, that are in this work, right? And how do we all collaborate together, right? As opposed to being in our own little silo, and thinking that in our own little silos, we're going to be able to change the world, right? We won't be able to do that until we all come together, understanding that we all have a common interest in this work.
You said something that was really key, that really sparked something. You said urgency, and how, people who are incarcerated don't have a day off. Like literally, there is no day off. Literally and figuratively, right? Like there is no days off from the emotional work that you have to do to survive every day in prison, from the spiritual work, from even the physical work, and to stay healthy and things like that. And sometimes it feels like within our movement to end mass incarceration and our greater movement around freedom, that those of us who've been impacted by this issue have a greater sense of urgency than those who have not been impacted. I guess I'm trying to get to react to you. Like, how do we? It feels like the urgency comes when someone like, for example, the George Floyd, recently getting killed, right? By the Minneapolis police office of a police department, and there is a sense of urgency now. Folks out like, well, we have to do this now. We have to do this now. But there's been, folks like yourself and others who've been beating the drum on a number of issues with that sense of urgency for a while now, for years now. So how do we kind of infect the people around us in these communities with that same urgency? I think you were getting at, as far as teaching the history and so on, hey, like, we are in all of these critical moments, but sometimes it feels like we get really riled up and it's really good, and then come November, to Mara White's question, come November, we're like, like that energy is not there, that urgency is not there, or sometimes even within the movement or within criminal justice work, where those who've been impacted have a greater sense of urgency. And not all the time, I don't want to, I can't say that's all the time, but this idea that, hey, these folks have never taken a day off, and we need to do this yesterday, versus, because it also translates into policy changes and even legislative change. So the urgency says, no, we need to just completely defund this entire thing, do the entire thing. While folks with a little bit more patience say, well, they just need more training, or they just need more, we just need more of this, more of this, more of this. When, like, to your point, we've been doing this for 100 years at the very least. I mean, we're doing this for a number of years, but.
Police brutality is nothing new, bro. Like, police brutality is nothing that just started. We've just now started consuming it because of the technology. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But like, I was just, the other day I was watching an old video of George Jackson's mother, right? And in that video, I guess they asked her a question like, why does your son do why does your son, engage in the work that, why does he do what he do? And it's like, her response was like, well, when you stop killing our people indiscriminately, then maybe he will stop doing what he's doing, right? And so it reminded me, like, yo, people getting killed by police is not something that just started to happen now. It's been happening, right? And there's a history to it, but we just never had the technology to consume it the way we do now, right? And I'm afraid now that it just becomes some type of, just something that we just consume now, and it's like, oh, here's another video. Like me, I stopped watching those videos. I don't need to watch those to be reminded what people, what these officers are doing, right? I know I've experienced it myself, right? My own brother was shot by the cops, right? So this is not something that I need to constantly watch to remind myself, like, oh, fucking police are killing people. Nah, man, police have been killing people for generations and for even centuries, right?
Yeah. No, I want to ask you a question. I see some questions in the comments, and I'm gonna get back to them. We talk about this idea of labeling people, right? And how when we label people, it gives us permission to treat them a certain way, And we've seen that on a number of different levels. I think, we both share the experience of being labeled a criminal, and how that labeling further perpetuates the oppression and marginalization, and has prevented us from doing a lot of things. And I think that we've, where some of us are able to overcome it. Some of us never get to a place where we're able to catch up. I've met people who've come home and been home for 10, 20 years and still facing challenges that the society puts up, right? But the labeling doesn't just go, it goes beyond that, right? And it goes, when we label groups terrorists, for example, how that gives us permission to treat them a certain way, or even when we label certain countries, there's that physical, verbal labeling, but then there's the emotional labeling, that when I look at you, I already label you and I think that you fit one of these categories, and how that, now I give myself permission to treat you a certain way. then I feel at peace at the end of the day because I feel like maybe you deserved it or whatever the case may be. And I preface this with saying that during my incarceration, I met correctional officers who said, well, Johnny, you broke the law. When I'm asking for an extra bar of soap or an extra roll of toilet tissue, or you know what, just give me 2 extra slices of bread because I don't eat the rest of this stuff, or you know, that you're serving me. And how many of the officers who harmed me felt justified because of the fact that they perceived that I was a bad person. Just mere fact that I was inside of a cell and based on mere, like, whatever messages they've been getting. So, you know, and then we also see the labeling, you know, specifically in California with, you know, so-called, like, you know, validating people, or not, I won't say validating, but like, you know, when you're classified a gang member, what does that mean inside? You know, not only inside, but even outside, and how you can be deprived of your liberty, literally at will, and all of these different, like, nuances. So I'm just trying to get you to react to that and some thoughts.
Right. And I think when it comes to labeling, a lot of times the labeling starts off at a very early age for a lot of us, in particular for those of us that are going to schools where they're not focused on nurturing our critical thinking, or not really to nurture our emotional intelligence, but instead they're already labeling you as a problem child, labeling you as you know, just all these different terms, you know, problem child, you know, whatever, you know, or even, you know, me being racialized at a very young age in elementary school, right? You know, being referred to as a spick or a wetback because of my family being, you know, flamenco, right? And then what that does to me, right? Like me, you know, as a kid, I never felt like I was either from here or from over there, right? Like I can't say that I'm flamenco because I was never born there. And then in my own country that I was born in, I'm made to feel like I'm not even a citizen here, right? And so the shit that does to especially to young people, right? It makes it very easy for us to accept these labels, and then we take pride in them. We're like, okay, well, I'm a thug, I'm a super predator. Okay, I'm gonna show you a super predator, right? And so, but
because it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where like the bad thing about labeling, and you know, not to get all academic with the labeling theory, is that sometimes we adapt the labels within ourselves that are placed upon us and live up to these labels, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So calling me a criminal does more than just harm me and create barriers, but it creates a space where I might want to say, you know what, maybe I am a criminal, or maybe I should be doing this, or maybe.
And you live in a community, in a neighborhood where the conditions are right for that behavior. You know what I mean? Like when folks don't have access to resources or to employment or to even education or a critical education, we get lost in all of this and the condition that exists in our own community, right? And we perpetuate that same ideology that was imposed on us, right? And so, and thinking in prison, bro, and thinking in prison, as you mentioned with the hunger strike, I mean, with labeling people as prison gang member or prison gang associate, right? In prison, in California prison specifically, anybody that was placed in solitary confinement, and particularly those that were placed in there indeterminately for as prison gang affiliation or prison gang membership, were referred to as the worst of the worst, right? And so, and for a long time, that label stuck, and it was okay to hold people in prison, in California prisons, for over 30 to 40 years in solitary confinement, not just holding people in prison, but holding people in solitary confinement, confined to themselves for 22 and a half hours a day, right? And it was acceptable because we've accepted the language, we've accepted the policies that were created that system, you know? And so the same way, and so for me, one thing that I look at is like the same practices that created the process to be able to put people in solitary confinement by labeling them prison gang associates or members, and the way it violates your due process, right? You don't have a right to appeal that, right? Well, you have a right to appeal it, but there's no due process, right? You have to appeal it, right? And so that can take a long time, right? That can take a long time to do, years, right? I have a friend here, right, Michael Saveta, who he filed an appeal on that, right?
Yes, shout out to Mike.
He's sitting with me, right? My moral support. And then, anyways, you know, the same practices that the way people were put in solitary confinement, like for instance, for me, and for a lot of people, I was put in solitary confinement for having Aztec and Mayan drawings.
How long did you spend in solitary then?
A total of 7 years.
Yeah.
And that's that's a long time, but even for me, like that ain't nothing compared to a good friend of mine, like Michael, right? He spent 15 years. Wow. And then there's my friend Jackie Morris, who spent 38, 38 years in solitary confinement.
It would have kept you longer had you not paroled, right?
And I would have stayed in solitary longer had I not came home.
Yeah.
I had a parole date.
Yeah.
So because of my parole date, I was released straight from solitary. But I want to go back
that in itself, and not to cut you, but that in itself speaks volumes how you're in this like, highly pressurized environment, right? I mean, emotionally pressurized, spiritually pressurized, like, there's all types of attack going on you. And then you go from this sensory deprived environment right into like the community,
2 days later, I was at a club, bro. The worst decision I could have made.
Yeah.
I went to my sister, like, oh, my friend want to take you to a club. All right, let's go. And I was in the back of the club, man, begging for cigarettes, but my anxiety was just kicking in. I was like, what the hell's going on? Like, why do I feel this way? You know what I mean? But anyways, the practices that would lead people into solitary confinement were based on like the way they identified people as prison gang associates and gang members was based on just some superficial evidence, right? Like for me, they use Aztec drawings, Mayan drawings. They use a newsletter from an organization out in San Diego called the Chicano Mexicano Prison Project, which was an abolitionist newsletter. And then also having a dictionary, right? A dictionary that it turns out it had somebody's name and number on there who was already validated. And so these 3 items right here were used to label me a prison gang associate, right? And so what that does though, and for Black people, right? For Black people, like for Raza or for Chicanos, Mexicanos, and Latinos, it's usually our cultura, right? Whether it's Mayan, Aztec, indigenous culture. For Black folks, it a lot of times it's political literature, whether they're reading Asada, George Jackson, Malcolm X. These things will get you placed in solitary confinement and label you and they'll label you as a prison gang, an associate to a prison gang, or
one way that you keep control is to keep people uneducated. So one way to keep the control is not only keep you educated and ignorant, but to go ahead.
And that's where I was. That was the point where I'm going to, like, once you start criminalizing people's political and cultural identity, people in general population are not going to want to learn that. If you're on the yard with the homies on GP and be like, hey, let's get into some Nahuatl, let's get into learning the native languages. Like, nah, fuck that shit. I don't want to know nothing about that. That's going to get me put in solitary confinement. And so now you don't know who you are, right? And it's very easy when you don't know who you are or where you come from. It's very easy to keep you separated. And for a very long time, the California prison system benefited from keeping people separated and at each other's throats, right? Whether it's through racial divide or geographical divide, right? And people for a long time weren't coming together, right? But it wasn't until the folks in solitary confinement in 2011 when they first organized the first hunger strike, right? And they created the Short Corridor Collective, right? The Short Corridor Collective in solitary confinement at Pelican Bay State Prison was made up of raza or brown people, Black people, and white people, right? That had been in solitary. A lot of these folks probably a combined time in solitary confinement, probably over 500 years, of like, even just like the main leadership of like maybe like the 10 people, right, combined, had probably over 250 years of solitary confinement experience, bro. Like some of these dudes have been in the shoe 20, 30 years, and so they came together, right, and agreed, like, the only way that we're gonna be able to end long-term solitary confinement in California prisons is that we come together, because they're using us against each other. They're saying that we can't, they won't let us out there because we can't get along, or so they came together and agreed to end hostilities between Black and brown and white people in general population. They sent out a call to end hostilities. They sent out a call to come together and figure out their differences in a diplomatic manner, right? And to refrain from using violence, right? And so that movement right there, led to 3 different hunger strikes, and finally to the end of abolishing long-term solitary confinement. They still hold you in solitary confinement, but they're not doing it to the level of what they were doing it before, right? But the thing is, though, even after the successes of the hunger strike, right? After the success of the Ashker versus Brown case, right? Again, our oppressors are not taking a day off. They are always thinking of new ways to kind of to put us back into
to reinvent the wheel.
Right? But what's happening right now in California prisons is they're merging yards, right? In California prisons, there's a lot of prisons that are designated sensitive needs yards, and the sensitive needs yards are people that have dropped out of these prison gangs or no longer affiliated, right? And so as Black, brown, and white people are coming together from general population, they're merging general population yard and sensitive needs yard to create conditions where people are not getting along.
Yeah.
And
so they know that people deliberately have tensions to create an environment where folks will act in a way which later on we can say, hey, this is why we need solitary, because look at them, they can't behave, right?
Exactly. And then another thing, right? Like, again, the way that they label people, associates and prison gang members, these tactics are tactics that also get exported other places, man. So, when you think about the wars and our attacks on the Middle East, right? And the way we incarcerate or what they call rendition, right? Rendition of we extract people who we label as terrorists and place them in Guantanamo Bay, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same thing, right? We're labeling people terrorists, and it could just be a neighbor telling on another neighbor, like, because he doesn't like them, oh, my neighbor's a terrorist, he's connected to Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatever. They come in, snatch him up, and now he ends up in Guantanamo Bay. Same thing, no due process in any kind of way to challenge his detainment, and they can end up in Guantanamo Bay for long-term, same way with people in the shoot.
Yeah. That reminds me, you said Guantanamo Bay, just wanted to give a shout out to my colleague, Matt.
Led to the peace out here between Black and Brown.
I also wanted to, thank you for that. Michael just reminded me that the organizing and the mobilizing that occurred in solitary confinement with the Short Corridor Collective and the way they were able to come together is something that it's also trickling back out into the streets, right? Mm-hmm. And that's something that especially right now, right? It's something that is highly needed, right? We're seeing in particular like places like in South Central, right, where Black and brown communities have been going, have been having conflict, right? People are coming together, right? Mm-hmm. People are coming together. These are the people that are at the bottom, right? People that we labeled either gang members or the worst of the worst. And they're the ones that are showing us true leadership, right? By putting aside their differences and coming together. Mm-hmm. And it's not something that's just happening here in South Central. It's happening throughout different places, right? And it's something that it's influenced by. It's something that's also, that needs to be reinforced, right? That we need to develop these leadership that's in these communities to take the lead in organizing folks on the street, right? Folks that are labeled street gang members or whatever, right? That we need to develop these leaders to be the ones to be at the forefront as well.
Yeah. So, that brings me, and I appreciate Victor Pate, who is a statewide organizer for the New York campaign against isolated confinement out of New York. And, he actually gave me my next question as far as segueing into, you bring up a lot of things, right? You bring up the power of unity. You also bring up the power of a political education. So when united and educated, I would venture to say that we will be exponentially more powerful than what we are now. Now, the question I want to ask you is, like, for example, next week I'll be interviewing Desmond Meade, who led Amendment 4 that gave people in Florida their voting rights back, over 1.4 million people, I believe.
I remember when they did that conference out there, people were doing the canvassing.
Yes.
The formerly incarcerated convicted people's conference. Yeah.
So the question, like, how do we now, and that's specific to Florida, but this political education, right? Educating people that, hey, in some states you can still vote while you're on parole, and educating folks and getting people civically engaged, and I'll read Victor's question is, how do we educate and empower impacted people on the electoral process and encourage this civic participation, right? Like, I think it's easy to get folks to come out and show for a rally, things to think, but, how do we really empower and educate our peers, to recognize their electoral civic power, and also to leverage that in a way that really does tip the scales in this country? Because I think that there's so many of us with the same experience. It's like millions of people, you know, like 70 million people have a criminal record on file, you know, and what does this mean when this class of disenfranchised people or newly enfranchised people can now tip the scales, whether it's a local election or even, dare I say, you know, a national election?
Well, I think definitely thinking, you know, this idea of thinking globally but acting locally, right? And recognizing that what's going on locally is also connected to a larger structure, right? And so, you know, when people talk about, oh no, let's you know, who we're gonna vote for, you know, vote for president or whatever, and people like seeing that that's something that's not really they have any voice in. You know, also reminding them that, you know, well, guess what? There's also political processes that occur in your own community, right? So thinking about like local elections, right? Whether it's city elections or county elections, state elections, right? These are all people that also still hold power, right? And they still hold the strings to the purse, right? Right. So how do we start advocating at the local level and start making moves at the local level? You know, and there's a lot of work here that's being done in LA, right? With Justice LA Coalition, right? You know, the work that they're doing, right? The work that folks are doing in Oakland, the work folks are doing, you know, throughout the state, and not just throughout California, but it's how do we also connect this work with the work being done in other places, right? Yes. Because it's important. And I think you're good at that, Johnny, in terms, at least in terms when it comes to the solitary confinement work, right? Like, you're not just thinking like New York, you're thinking like, no, solitary confinement is not just a New York issue. It's a global issue, country, right? And so you're always, you know, thinking about like, how do I bring in other folks to come talk about what's going on in, you know, in their locality, right, or in their state, right? And I think that's important, right? As we think locally, also acting globally, right? And being able to connect our struggles with the struggles of other people, right? And thinking about how do we support each other, you know?
No, I really appreciate that and I wrote myself a note about it because it's, you know, acting locally but thinking globally. I think about how all of our actions has to be tied to a larger strategy, and doing it in such a way in which honors the work of others and doesn't undermine it, but pushes it forward. And I'll tell you, one of the main concerns around COVID-19, I want us to talk about COVID-19, is that this current political moment would be, I see you got a burning desire. Go ahead, get it out.
Bro, I just got a text right now, man. One of the main organizers from the hunger strike was just granted parole, bro.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
The brother Satawa, man, Satawa Dewberry was one of the organizers. Yeah. It just came in right now. No,
that's how it is. Yeah. That's how it is. Yeah.
He's definitely one of the peace builders from the hunger strike movement, and he was just granted parole, which is it's amazing because people that were in that work were not being granted parole, bro. So this is big, yo. This is big.
Yeah. You know,
sorry about that, but yeah.
I know I celebrate the same joy anytime that anyone gets released, because how difficult it is, and incarceration only promises you more incarceration, you know. And even myself, you know, the type of sentence that I had a release date, you know, and I met friends who don't have release dates, or it says X, 0000, right? But knowing that, yes, despite the fact that I have a release date, I know that I can get lost in here, I can die in here. I've had friends die, you know, and knowing that, hey, you can get sentenced to a year, but that year can be the last year that you live. So congratulations for making, you know, for making this parole and things like that. And let's see if we can get them plugged in, or not even get them plugged in, to find out from like whatever they need. And which brings me to this acting locally, thinking globally, you know, and for me, what that means is that, you know, like to your point earlier, like the work can't be siloed. And what that means is that we constantly have to check in with each other, right? A, B, and mind you, we don't all like to check in with each other, right? And that's our own BS, you know, but really checking in with each other. You know, what are you seeing out there? What are you doing? Like, I'm thinking about doing this. Does this harm your work in any way? What should I be saying? How's that? What should I be saying? Just for better yet, you know, are you available to say it yourself? And it just so happens like I have the ability to create that space, so you have the ability of really, really working in a way in which doesn't undermine each other's work. And in COVID-19 era, and like I told you, you know, earlier, I think I mentioned how, you know, we've seen an exponential increase in solitary confinement we recently released a report that amplifying the work of Solitary Watch and the Marshall Project, which highlighted it was an over 500% increase in solitary in a matter of months. We went from 68,000 or so to one of the biggest federal one of the largest federal lockdown in 25 years, where people are restricted to their cells. This time because of what was happening in the street, but they were already on modified lockdown because of COVID-19. And what NRCAT saw through our work is that we saw corrections responding with solitary confinement to regular, to things that are not rule violations. It's not a rule violation to have a fever. It's not against the rules to cough. And there's a lot of layers there, right? There's this idea about responding to public health with punishment. The same way we see it in society, we see it inside of prisons. But then there's another layer there around, really not recognizing the humanity of people that are incarcerated and punishing them for being sick, but still being good enough to work and protect PPE and create PPE equipment for people in society while still being contraband themselves. Some departments had policies that didn't even allow people to wear masks because you can't cover your face in prison. They had to actually make policy changes to allow people to do that. So, yeah, just get it.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I'm going to suggest that you also maybe sometime in the future interview Michael, because everything that you just talked about.
I'm ready to bring Michael on now.
everything that you're talking about right now is the litigation that he's currently working on right here in LA, right? And so he could probably definitely speak on it better than I can, but I would say that we're looking at the weaponization of COVID-19.
Good. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so and the way that is being used to continue to perpetuate this narrative of people needing to be incarcerated, right? And for instance, something that I was talking to Michael recently was there was in LA County Jail, there was a video that was being spread around by the LA County Sheriff, right? And talking about how, these people that are in confinement, they're infecting themselves. They're all sharing the same cup. They're all coughing on each other. And people get the impression like, okay, this is a group of, these people were all, what they didn't mention was that these are the mental health facilities. Right? Like, how do you expect people to socially distance when they don't even have, some of them are the capacity to even think critically, right? So, but they're weaponizing something, without mentioning that this is the medical facility. They took it as out of context and say, this is everybody in county jails doing this, when that's not the case.
Yeah.
And the excuse was like, they're doing this in order, because, supposedly we're going to start releasing people, but nobody's getting released, man. And the people that are getting released are always going to be, we're going to get caught up in the non conversation, like non-violent and all that, right?
Yeah, the dichotomy. It's funny. We last week I had a conversation with Michelle Jones, who co-founded Constructing Our Futures out of Indiana. And, it's reentry organization working with, women and girls, and providing them reentry services, And what she mentioned on that call was that she saw that, of course, we saw this nationwide lockdown where almost any carceral facility literally locked their facilities down, right? And we've also seen this throughout history. We saw it during 9/11. We saw it during Hurricane Katrina, where people were literally drowned in their cells and left for dead because the officers saved themselves. And then of course we saw this kind of dehumanization, if you will, this othering of people during COVID-19, where no, we shouldn't let them out, et cetera. And what she's seeing there is that the lockdowns were never lifted, despite the fact that society or people out in the world were already in phase 3 or 4 of their COVID-19 reentry process, but the women were still held, in solitary. And when you talk about it being when you talk about holding people indefinitely and also subjecting them to these, one of the concerns that we have is that COVID-19 will be used to not only roll back the changes that we've already seen, another great example is bail reform in New York, but also, right, to put us in a worse place where we'll spend the next 2 years unraveling the next 6 months.
Right.
So, Yeah, just getting your thinking and reactions to that, you know?
Just kind of get it clear. Like,
in other words, let me say this. What can we do now in this moment, right? There's two moments, right? There's the moment of national panic around health and a real conversation about people who are the most vulnerable and most susceptible to die from this virus. And then there's another moment, you know, of a racial uprising, if you will, where people are demanding justice, and not just I want to say it's led by, you know, it's led by Black people, but it's really supported by people of all races and colors. I like what you talked about, how folks in, you know, in different parts of Cali are coming together. We've seen in other parts of the country. You know, so from your point of view, you know, what are things that we can be doing in this moment right now to do two things: to either advance, you know, our collective goals, right, or to make sure that we don't give them any yardage. For
yeah, definitely, because
you know,
I think of that. I think about that a lot, right? Like, what is what's going to happen after, you know, all this, these uprisings that are happening, right? And the social unrest, right? Due to continuous police brutality, right? What kind of policies are going to get put in place that are going to continue to perpetuate and maintain this system, right? And although, as we're arguing to you know, some people are talking about reform police and other people are talking about abolish it, like being mindful that more cameras are not going to make us safer. I mean, recognizing that you know, even though or even more training of police is not going to make us safer, or even hiring more people of color in the police forces, right? I don't think that's going to make us safer, right? Because it's a system, yo, and it's a system, and as part of the system, you know, people get caught up in it and end up either buying into it or staying silent. And there's a perfect example in the images of what happened with George Floyd, of people of color who are police officers staying silent, right? And so that's something that I think about, right? So being always, you know, I guess being vigilant of making sure that we don't lose the gains that we've already gained, man. You know, because we can definitely lose a lot of yardage and end up back at fucking square one. You know, and so but it's you know, it's a fucked up situation, man. You know, and we thinking about, you know, the most marginalized, right? Especially when it comes to COVID-19, right? We talk about, you know, in downtown LA, they got this big building, bro, that they said, oh, we love essential workers. But yet when they come to unionizing, you fucking fire all of them. You know what I mean? So do you really care about essential workers, or are you just saying that just because it's part of the rhetoric that's going on right now with COVID-19, right? As people are trying to unionize and mobilize to get better working standards, we're going to continue to see people being displaced because of the work that they're trying to do, right? And recognizing that workers organizing for better working conditions is tied to the work that we're also doing. You know, I mean, we have to recognize that all of this, you know, again, not operating in silos and seeing issues of police brutality siloed from issues of workers' right, or you know, siloed on issues of like resources for people that are coming home from prison, right? These are all things that are all tied together, right? And how do we continue to build folk or organizing capabilities and capacity to come together and work on these issues so that we don't continue to lose yardage on the things that we've already gained, and also continue to push forward to build more change. So
we have a few minutes left, Danny, and I want to make sure that we talk directly to what you're doing. And I know I'll tell you this hour's going to go fast. You know, so you know, you know, in addition to being really a leader and around solitary, man, you know, long before I came home and was doing this work and like really doing it. But I want to ask you about Underground Scholars and the importance of education. You know, what is Underground Scholars? Why, you know, why is important? You know, and then add some calls to action, like in this moment that people can do, you know, in this moment to not only support you and support Underground Scholars, but also calls to action overall on this movement, you know?
Right. So yeah, we co-founded. There was a group of folks at UC Berkeley in 2003. We came together to create Underground Scholars, right? And we really just wanted to create at first, it just started with just wanting to create a space at the university where we can all come together, formerly incarcerated and system impacted. System impacted being defined by students who have a loved one, you know, a father or a husband, a wife, whatever, a son incarcerated. And also, I think for me, I also consider system impacted people that actually grew up in the hood, right? Like getting pulled over, seeing their friends getting arrested, and still made it out made it to UC Berkeley, right? Because it is hard to transition through, you know, all that and still be able to make it to a place like UC Berkeley, right? So, but Underground Scholars started with the idea of, you know, just trying to create a space for us, right? Where we can all come together, right? And little by little, we start, you know, asking ourselves like, well, we can do more than just that. Like, we're all here, we all have a voice, we all have a position that we can play, right? And what can we build, right? That's going to be transformative, not just for us, but also for the university, right? And how do we make the university accessible to people that are incarcerated and on the periphery, right? Or of society, right? And our goal was really, you know, to we're at a Research One institution, right? This is where knowledge is being produced about the conditions that we come from, right? But the knowledge is being produced by people that don't even come from that environment, right? That have a bird's eye view of the condition, unlike us, who went through that system, who went through that experience, are now in a place where we can also develop our critical thinking, our analysis, to offer a perspective from that of a formerly incarcerated person, right? And using that position to change the narrative about what incarceration is and how it impacts our communities, right? And that's, you know, one of the things that we were doing, right? And we also do, you know, Underground Scholars also does a lot of work around supporting folks that are incarcerated and that are coming home. We write letters to the parole board. You know, that's something that folks can do, right? Like, you know, there's organizations, you know, that you can find on Facebook, like there's the lifers groups that do support for folks that are lifers, right? In California, you know, we got people going to parole board, and one of the things that I do is I'm always writing letters on behalf of people that are on parole, right? And I write letters as a resource. You know, if folks want to continue their education when they come home, that's what I'm here for. You know, to support them and help them in that transition, right? There is a call to defund the UCPD, right? The UCPD is it's a police department throughout every UC campus, right? And right now, folks, I believe it was the Black Student Caucus or the Black Alumni Student Caucus were leading an initiative to defund the police, and also the policy work that you know, we do a lot of I also, it's important to mention that although I'm the co-founder of Underground Scholars, I don't work directly for Underground Scholars, but I do support their work and their mission, right? And they are an abolitionist organization, right? And so a lot of the work they also do is policy advocacy and trying to create policies that are going to impact our community in a positive way, right? And one of the things that they're pushing for right now is a bill it's a good time credit bill for people that are on parole and going to school, to be able to get them off parole for every semester that they complete.
Could you do me a favor and just send that all to me, and I'll email it out for folks who are watching, at least on the Zoom, who registered. You know, we'll follow via email and add this information via email and links where you can connect directly with Danny. You know, Danny, I want to thank you so much, man. If I was closer to you, I'd give you a hug, brother. I really appreciate you and everything that you said, your vision, your leadership. You know, I appreciate that you're on the other side of the country, and we always find ways to still connect.
For sure. Any ways that NRCAT can support you in your work. You know, we also hold the value of empowering people, you know, who have direct experience of incarceration or solitary survivors like yourself, who are out there trying to do the work that you're already doing. And that means change the narrative and policy change and all the things that we talked about. You know, so I want to tell folks who are watching, you know, thank you so much. We'll follow up via email if you registered. You know, join us next week. I'll actually be talking to Desmond Meade, Executive Director of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, and we'll be talking about community organizing and what does it mean when 1.4 million people get their voting rights back, what's next, things of that nature. And of course, always happy to send me any ideas that you have about who I should be talking to. Again, this platform is not mine. You know, my only job is— My first idea is this guy right here.
Yeah, so let's get Michael in there. Yo, you're next. Is good. You know, well, we'll put you in the roster, but yeah, totally. So nothing but love to y'all. Peace, love, and happy Juneteenth, everyone. Please enjoy.
Likewise, man. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Peace.